Well, the Pittsburgh Steelers make a splash as soon as they are able to, as far as free agency goes. Former Super Bowl champ and nine-time Pro Bowler Russell Wilson coming to Pittsburgh on a very discounted deal, $1.2 million. Shout out to the Broncos for picking up the rest of what he's owed this year, $38 million. And it's creating a whole lot of controversy as far as the quarterback position goes with the Pittsburgh Steelers. What does this mean for Kenny Pickett's future in Pittsburgh? What's going to happen as far as Russell joining the Steelers? Is he going to start right away? Is he brought in to be Pickett's backup? Well, we're going to talk about all of that with good friend Nick Farabaugh. Nick, a beat writer for Steelers Now, and has been in that role for the better part of the last year or so. Nick, man, thanks for taking some time. I would have to imagine that as the news breaks late Sunday night, I know it kept me at work for an extra hour and a half. I know you were up into the wee hours of the morning getting it all squared away on your end. Just to walk me through it, man. I mean, what was it like, getting that piece of news that the Steelers make a splash for a discounted price, Russell Wilson, but he's coming to the Steelers, man.
Dude, I mean, it's one of those things that you're like, Russell Wilson is a Pittsburgh Steeler, and it's like, whoever thought you'd be saying it, right? Like 2 years ago, even when he just got traded from the Seahawks to the Broncos, it was like, that's never going to happen. So the fact that it actually is happening, first of all, is just stunning. I think that was the first thing I was like, man, like it's like with Patrick Peterson last year. Like it's the same reaction. Like,
Yeah.
do you ever think Patrick Peterson was ever going to wear a Steelers uniform, right? Like now Russell Wilson's going to wear a Steelers uniform. So I saw it and I wasn't shocked. Out of the splashy options at quarterback, he made the most sense because you knew he was going to get the vet min because the Broncos were on the hook for $39 million guaranteed, so he could do that. So it made the most sense, and it probably doesn't completely rule out a path for competition. So that's another thing, right? Like it's not like they're signing Kirk Cousins where they're paying him 45 a year, 90 guaranteed, and they are 100% going to start him. Like so. I don't think it's fully there, but listen, man, that it was chaos because this is a future Hall of Fame quarterback that they signed, even if he isn't what he was at his peak. I mean, that is a splash and a half. It's certainly a buzzy name that they signed, and it's one of them that I thought made the most sense for them to sign.
Yeah, I mean, do you think, like, hypothetically, he's available as a free agent, but the Broncos aren't responsible for $38.5 million of his salary? So, like, let's say Russell Wilson, a complete free agent, and can get however much money he wants or really needs to. Does this deal even happen if it's even for maybe 10, 12, $15 million, somewhere in that range? Or do you think the Steelers looked at this and said, we don't have to pay this guy very much of anything, and he's available, let's go do it?
Yeah, no, I think it was value relative to the position, right? I mean, we're talking about probably at this point, he's probably like the 20th best quarterback in the NFL, somewhere around there for the vet min. But if you had to pay him based off name value, reputation, $15 million, well, we saw what Gardner Minshew got today, which was a lot of money. I think Russ would have gotten more than that probably on the open market. So you're talking $15 million potentially there. I don't think this happens. I think then we were back talking, okay, Mason Rudolph maybe returns, Ryan Tannehill, someone in that range of quarterbacks, not Russell Wilson. So this was like perfect value because when you're paying Russell Wilson $85 million in dead cap, like the Broncos are, for example, not as good when you have the 20th best quarterback. But when the 20th best quarterback's paying on the vet min for $1.21 million, the value is pretty exceptional for that. So he not only presented as a cost-effective option, but he presents as a guy that has upside for the year. So it made sense. But I'm telling you, if you had to pay him whatever 2 years or 1 year 15, I don't think this happens.
This pretty much also rules out any potential for Mason Rudolph to return if there was any before, right? I think this pretty much seals the fate of Rudolph playing elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's always the option where he has a completely cold market and doesn't have any suitors and comes back again in that QB3 role. But I think he would also kind of say that he wouldn't want to do that again and would at least want an opportunity to compete for a 2 role next year at somewhere. So, yeah, I think Mason Rudolph, the door isn't completely shut, but about 99% sure that he's probably gone. Rightfully so, because I think he will have a market. I think he showed enough to have a market. We'll see where he lands and what his contract will be. But yeah, I think this is it for Mason Rudolph in Pittsburgh.
So I think the $1 million question after the fact that it's confirmed, Russ confirmed it himself on Twitter, he's coming to the Steelers. Is he coming to start? What do you think?
I think if Russell Wilson, first of all, I don't think had a super robust market. I don't think that the Steelers beat out like 5 other teams to land his services. I'm sure there were other teams like the Giants, for example, that maybe wanted him. The Raiders maybe were in this. The Vikings probably would have been in this conversation now that they had lost Kirk Cousins.
Yeah.
But I don't think they were against a ton of teams. So I think this represented a fit for a few reasons. One, Mike Tomlin and I think him mesh well. I think Mike Tomlin and Russ kind of respect each other on that level of football championship winning people. They have this kind of magnetic presence about each other. So I think they respect each other on that level. So I think that's part of why this happened. Also, I just think the infrastructure that the Steelers have, defensively with TJ Watt, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Cam Hayward, Joey Porter Jr., all these guys. Offensively, having George Pickens, Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, Pat Freiermuth, Deontay Johnson, all these guys, it gave Russ a clearer picture of how this is going to work, right? The Giants have a lot to add. The Raiders still had a lot to add under a new head coach, even if Antonio Pierce is this real buzzy name. The Vikings would have been an interesting fit because Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, they have some interesting pieces there. But obviously the Steelers jumped on this early, and that's probably a big reason why they did. They wanted Russ to kind of sign on the dotted line here. But I'll say this. So I think he is more likely than not to start. I think that's pretty clear. I don't think he necessarily would have signed if he didn't have some assurance that it was 100% a true competition. So this is 100% open competition.
Yeah.
I don't think that they are going to just hand it to Russell Wilson. Like, I don't think this is a farce of a competition. Like, I think Kenny Pickett's going to have a chance here. If he can play well, I think Kenny Pickett will have a chance to at least impress the coaches. Arthur Smith flew down to Florida and met with Kenny for an entire day to lay out a vision. And I don't think Russell Wilson coming on the market and being a possible target was unexpected. I think the Steelers expected this. I think this was in the works for weeks. That was a bridge that was crossed long ago, probably back last month when Russ knew he was leaving. So I don't think this was unexpected in their plans. So do I think Russell Wilson will start? Yes, that's my prediction. Do I think it's because they are just going to hand it to him and this isn't going to be a competition? No, I think they got the stiffest possible competition for Kenny Pickett without completely discarding Kenny Pickett to the side this year. So I think he will have a chance to win the competition. But yeah, I'm going to say Russell Wilson probably does start week 1, but I think there's going to be a competition in the trip.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Kenny will get he's been here the last couple of years. He's been our guy, first round pick. He'll get that treatment as far as the depth chart goes, maybe into OTAs a little bit as well. And then maybe even for the first preseason game, like Pickett's QB1 on the depth chart. But as camp rolls, the preseason rolls along, you'll probably see Russell Wilson become the number 1 quarterback on the depth chart for however long that will be. What does this do for Kenny Pickett mentally? I mean, you know him from covering him at Pitt as well. I would like to think that he's going to turn this into a positive and really come back to team activities and really treat this like a competition and try to get him to be better. But, you can't help but feel a little bit slighted. I feel like this team took me in the first round 2 years ago, and now all of a sudden they're bringing in a guy that is some very legitimate competition.
Well, if I'm Kenny Pickett, I have to have a doubt of how much belief they have in me. I know Omar Khan said full faith, and they've reiterated this time and time again. But, folks, you don't sign Russell Wilson, even for the vet men, without having some doubt about that guy being your franchise guy. It just doesn't happen, right? They wouldn't have signed him. They would have signed a cheap free agent that isn't threatening to Kenny Pickett, someone that wasn't going to push him, someone that made him the sure starter. This doesn't do that. So clearly there are some doubts there about what Kenny Pickett is, what he can be. So that's how I would take it if I were Kenny Pickett. I'd say, okay, these guys don't believe in me fully. Now, I can turn that into a few things. I could turn that into, yeah, I'm going to show up this OTAs. I'm going to show up in training camp, and I'm just going to outplay the guy, and I'm going to win the competition anyways. Because, again, I think he does have a chance to win that competition. Like, I do not think he is 100% the backup week 1. I think it's more likely than not he will be, but I don't think it's 100%. So if he comes out, takes a leap in year 3, and he looks like this new quarterback under Arthur Smith, I think he can win the job. So I think that's one way to do it. I think the other is, okay, they signed this Hall of Fame quarterback, and you could probably view it from Kenny Pickett's expectation is the guy's going to start anyways. They did this with Mason Rudolph. They did this with Mitch Trubisky his rookie year, right? Those competitions in 22, like 22, Mitch was starting. It was going to happen. Mason Rudolph was going to be the 3. Like there's different things. Like sometimes that's just how it happens. These coaching staffs have it made up a lot of the time. And so Kenny Pickett can take it like that and say, all right, I worked under an offense coordinator that probably no one thought was very good in Matt Canada for 2 seasons. So I didn't really get a chance in a real NFL offense. So the other idea is Kenny goes, all right, I want to go somewhere else. And I want to get a chance somewhere else in the NFL, even if that's as a backup to sit for a year or whatever. I want to go to another place, learn an offense, and show what I can do somewhere else because I don't feel like this is the place where I can do it. So I think there's 2 ways you can take it. I think he takes one. I think he will take the first route because I kind of knowing Kenny, he's a competitive guy that looks at it that way. So I expect that to be the way he goes, but there's definitely 2 sides to that. And for sure, he has to take it as a slight and say, all right, those full faith comments, like they aren't true because clearly you wouldn't be bringing in Russell Wilson if they were.
He's Nick Farabaugh from Steelers Now. It seems like the national perception of this whole signing of Russell Wilson to the Steelers, I feel like a lot of these national guys are saying, I love the fit. I think it's a great fit for both him and for the Steelers. But, your initial response to this on Steelers Now, what I got to read was that you were kind of questioning the fit based off of some of the numbers that Russ had last year. If you want to go into that a little bit, I mean, I thought Warren Sharp put out a great tweet kind of highlighting those numbers, and they are concerning. 27% of his passes last year, all of them from behind the line of scrimmage, highest out of 509 QBs that qualify since 05. 62% of his passes within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. And you've got an Arthur Smith offense that he's going to want to run the ball, number one, but then utilize play action to utilize the middle of the field, which is something that Wilson didn't do a whole lot of last year. So talk about maybe some of the concerns you have with the fit.
Yeah, so some of the fit stuff that I have a concern with is, one, Russell Wilson had the least amount of passes in the middle of the field last year out of any quarterback in the NFL, period. That's the truth. Arthur Smith's Atlanta offense from 11 to 20 yards had the most targets in that area of the field. Russ was last. That's an odd statistic when you're thinking about it. But then the reports came out that Russell Wilson and Arthur Smith felt good about this fit, which is weird to say. They're not dumb. Like, they know about these stats. They know about that fact. So there's 2 explanations I have for that. The stat is concerning, but one, either Arthur Smith thinks Russell Wilson can operate in that middle of the field area and it feels like they can't. I mean, listen, when Russ did it last year, he had 163 attempts, completed 109 of those. He threw for 15 touchdowns and only 3 picks. So there is some good there, but it was not a high amount. And also, you talk about air yards per pass attempt. Russell had 3.8 air yards per pass attempt. Kenny Pickett at 3.7. I mean, they were very similar in terms of what areas of the field they were targeting last year. Russ doesn't really operate the quick game very well, but they also didn't let Russ do a ton down the field. His deep ball is still very good. That was always his selling point, right? That moon ball, deep ball that is elite. It's there. His arm is still there. He's not as athletic as he once was, so he can't play that out of structure chaos ball. He tries to do it. He takes some really bad sacks. His pocket management is pretty bad. So they don't have the offensive line yet for him. So they need to add that, in my opinion, to try and beef up that offensive line, make Russ as comfortable as possible. But that middle of the field stat, that's concerning. So some things that they have to really lean into, I thought one of the things he did really well last year was play action, both under center and a shotgun. His under center play action stuff, that's always been his bread and butter, where he can just get deep drops, target the deep middle of the field, and let those moon balls go. But even the shotgun, they only allowed him to do it 34 times last year, Sean Payton did. It's not really part of Sean Payton's offense, but he averaged 10.6 yards per attempt there. That was 3rd in the NFL. And when he was with Seattle, he was able to really uncork that too. Atlanta did that the 2nd most out of any team last year. I think that's a big part of it. empty as well when Russ kind of can just sit back there, kind of how Ben was with tempo. When he got an empty or shotgun, he could just read defenses and call things out and let it go. Russ can do that. So I think empty sets are kind of where you're going to go. And again, Atlanta used that a lot more last year than Denver did. So I think there are positives to where this can go. Also, Russ isn't going to be throwing the ball as much as he did last year. Broncos is not of a great run game last year. Najee Harris and Jalen Warren theoretically should be a big part of this offense and running the ball. So Russ should only be throwing 20 to 25 times per game, and maybe you can get those deep balls going. So odd fit, but I think there are avenues where this can kind of work. I'm just kind of wondering how they're kind of going to mesh it all together.
No, absolutely. And I mean, you look at his numbers a year ago in Denver, 26 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. The last 2 years in Denver, 42 touchdowns to 19 interceptions. Passing touchdowns is something that the Steelers have not seen a whole lot of since Ben Roethlisberger retired. And you can combine 26 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. Seems like he's able to put the ball in the end zone and keep it away from the defense, which is also something that, especially last year as a rookie, that Kenny kind of struggled with. And historically, Russ is pretty darn efficient when it comes to that category as well. 334 touchdowns to only 106 interceptions. So he can take care of the football, which I'm sure was a very attractive trait to Mike Tomlin and Arthur Smith.
Yeah, and again, a big part of that's because he doesn't target the middle of the field. Like that's the most dangerous area, right? Like that's the most dangerous area of the field. So when you don't target it, you're not going to throw a ton of picks. And the deep ball is never really in harm's way because the deep ball is just so accurate and so good. So really, what the key for Russ is going to be is it's going to be making sure to take care of that football, but he's got to get the quick game going. So the thing about Russ is, teams are starting to move more to these 2 safety looks in the NFL where they can take away these deep balls. And for teams, so the big thing that has really kind of evolved with quarterbacks is, all right, you got to take what is given to you, right? Mahomes has been great at this, even though he has an absolute cannon of an arm and he can uncork those deep balls. He just takes what is given to him underneath. That's been Russ's trouble. That's been his adjustment that hasn't really come. So that's what you're going to have to coax out of him. I'm not sure how you do it. He's 35 years old. You know what Russ is at this point. Russ is going to play Russ ball, but you got to mitigate that, get him to play in the pocket a little more. So he will take care of the football. It's just how can you create explosive plays and still make sure you're moving the ball down the field? Because you can be efficient, but if you're not actually moving the ball down the field that much, it doesn't really matter because, the Broncos did 3 and out a ton last year where Russ didn't execute a play and they would just punt. But he could execute those in the red zone. The red zone is really where he shines. So if the Steelers can run the football really well, I think that's where Russ becomes a really intriguing option because I talked about those 2 safety sets. Well, how do you get teams out of 2 safety sets? You run the ball really well. So that could open up the deep ball. I will say this. Stock up for George Pickens, like way up for George Pickens. That's who I think is the biggest winner of this.
How do you think he'll gel in that locker room? I mean, you look at it the last couple of years, a lot of young offensive weapons, really all under 25, 26 years old, with the exception of Deontay Johnson, with, for the majority of it, a young quarterback in Kenny Pickett. You've got all of these young weapons now, and you throw in a 35-year-old, going to be 36 at some point during the season, quarterback that's been playing in the league for, at the start of next year, 13 years. And there's been stories about how, he has been amongst teammates and things of that nature. Do you maybe see any potential for conflict off the field and in the locker room with Russ gelling with some of the guys offensively?
I mean, sure. I think that's always a problem when we know the history is there. How the office is set up, like that was a thing where he was kind of separate from the locker room. Some of those things, I think some of them are kind of unfounded. There's guys that, you'll talk to that loved Russ. There's guys that didn't like him. Like Richard Sherman has been very vocal about Russ and his distaste for him during his Seattle days. So do I think there's some possibility that could happen? Yes. But I will say I've talked to enough guys too that like Russ that have bought into what he does in the locker room and like him. I think a lot of, Russ's kind of locker room problems can be traced back to the fact that he hasn't been the same guy. So he's getting paid a ton of money. And when you're not a franchise quarterback like you once were, a lot of the stuff you once did doesn't kind of get away anymore, right? These
Mhm.
guys are like, okay, this guy can't do this anymore. He's not, a top 5 quarterback in the NFL anymore. So humble yourself a little bit. And I think Russ has kind of started to realize that a little bit from what I talked to from guys on last year's Broncos team. And from what I've kind of heard, that is something that I think he's working on. So can there be conflict? Of course there can be. He has a history of it. He has a history of guys in Seattle and Denver not liking him at times. But is it going to be like 100% at the forefront for me? I don't think so. I'm not going to make that assumption that all of a sudden, this guy comes into this locker room and it's just going to blow up.
Yeah.
Especially with Mike Tomlin at the helm. That's one of his best traits. He can manage personalities and kind of get them to work together.
As far as Russell Wilson goes and with Mike Tomlin, right? So these guys been around for a very long time. Russ has played against Mike Tomlin a handful of times as well. They share some ideas as far as wanting to build a winning culture. What kind of role do you think that, obviously a big one that Mike Tomlin played in getting Russell Wilson here, but how do you think that relationship will play itself out?
Yeah, obviously a huge role in getting him here. That feels like one to me that works. Just because Mike Tomlin has respect for guys that have won at the highest level of football, that he reveres these guys in. And I feel like Russell Wilson is certainly one of those guys that he would revere as, okay, this is a guy that has won significant football games before. This is a guy that has playoff success. This is a guy that was at the pinnacle of the sport multiple times. So I feel like, he has that level of respect for Russ. And I think Tomlin is that type of guy that goes into a room and really kind of magnetizes it. And so I think he views Russ as a guy that has obviously gotten there. So he would probably feel like Russ is the type of guy that can do the same. So I think that relationship will work out pretty fine. I think Mike Tomlin's certainly not going to let Russ kind of run roughshod in the locker room. I will say that if you are concerned about Russ kind of separating himself from the locker room, not being close enough, that's not Mike Tomlin's thing. He wants these guys being close, becoming friends, becoming very personable with each other. If that doesn't happen, Mike Tomlin steps in. So he's not going to let that happen. He's not going to let a natural separation like that happen. So I do think there will be potential, little bumps on the road here, but I think there's a level of respect among these guys because Mike Tomlin, super winning coach, Russell Wilson, super winning quarterback. Those two respect each other because they're both going to be in Canton someday, and there's a level of respect
Yeah.
between these guys that I know is there.
All right. So from two areas of yes, this is going to work out, or no, it won't, right? 1 year vet minimum. It doesn't work out. Russell Wilson obviously would at that point prove he doesn't have it anymore. You cut ties and you chalk it up for what it was in 2024. It didn't work out. But let's say on the flip side, you copy and paste 3,000 yards, 26 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions to the Steelers in 2024. What happens in 2025 for Wilson and the Steelers and Kenny Pickett?
Yeah, that's tough because
And
I
then
know
you
the
add
stat.
at that point, I'd say, Nick, like 11 wins and they win a playoff game because Baker Mayfield won a playoff game for Tampa this
Yeah.
year. So with that stat line, let's say the Steelers go 11-6 and they make it to the divisional round with Russell Wilson leading the way the whole time. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that would imply to me the 26-8 looks different than it did last year. The 26-8 is deceiving last year. I know it's a pretty stat line, but the tape is not nearly as good. And the stats also bear out the limitations that he had and why Denver didn't make it. But Denver, during their winning streak that they had, that's when Russ was at hyper efficiency. That's when he was playing well. So if they get to the divisional round, you're talking probably a playoff win. So if that 26-8 looks efficient, it looks like Russ evolving his game a little bit, starting to fit pieces in, dishing the ball out underneath. I think, that's a harder aspect. Certainly, I don't think Pickett can, kind of find his way back in there. I think you're probably talking about, okay, what can we do with Russ's contract? Probably you're trying to get him back. The Steelers have like the third most cap space right now in 2025 projected. Probably not going to stay that way. They have a few guys that they're probably going to extend and obviously sign, but they have a lot of cap, so they could theoretically take on a Russ contract, whether it's a year or two, if they like that. Also wouldn't preclude them from adding a young quarterback. I think that would be something. It might give them an Aaron Rodgers scenario where, okay, they could sign him for 2 years, draft a guy early, have that guy sit, and then take over. Like, they could have that scenario work. So that's kind of what I would view it as. If you say that 26-8 is a good 26-8, and listen, there's no guarantee just because they make the playoffs in the divisional round that 26-8 is pretty. It might be ugly. You would think this year, based on 10-7 wild card round, even if the loss, you're like, okay, Kenny Pickett probably took a leap, right? Like, that's probably what happened. But obviously, completely insane season that you come out of with absolutely no quarterback answer. And so it's possible that happens, but I'm just going to assume that 26-8 looks a little prettier because they win a playoff game, they make it the divisional round. If you're talking, he has a Baker Mayfield like season, I think you're talking about a short extension and maybe, okay, let's see maybe what we can do to get a young quarterback in here and let's actually execute that plan, that succession plan that you had been talking about for so long under Ben Roethlisberger. It's a chance to reset.
And as free agency rolls along, Nick, before we let you go, the Steelers, around 24 million, give or take, in cap space. Where do you see them being able to utilize that before the draft starts? Where would you like to see them go position-wise? And maybe if you have a couple names in mind.
Yeah, I think defense. I think it needs to be defensive heavy because I feel like the offensive line is going to be a big focus in the draft. So corner, safety, linebacker. You probably want to fill one of those offensive holes, maybe get a center. But the centers have really flown off the board early on in this period. Like as we're recording, Aaron Brewer got signed. The starting center market's very bare right now. So that feels like a draft need. So, corner, a lot of the top corners, Chidobe Awuzie, Sean Murphy Bunting, Ronald Darby, they're off the board, but you can go get a guy like Kenny Moore, put him in the slot. Kendall Fuller, play inside or outside. Adoree Jackson, someone like that fits right in. Linebacker, I think there's a lot of names, but I think my favorite that's out there right now is Willie Gay from the Chiefs. I think he's a really good player, young, could be a real corner piece for you. And then you talk about safety. I mean, there's so many safeties that are out there right now, even with a lot of them being signed. It's just so deep of a safety group. I'm talking about, Julian Blackmon, Cam Curl, someone like that makes a lot of sense to me to add that can be versatile and let Minka kind of roam around. I think you still need to look, at center. There's guys out there. Maybe kick the tires on Connor Williams from the Dolphins. Williams suffered a torn ACL at the end of last year, week 14, but he was probably the best center out there right now before that. So you might be able to get him on a cheap deal and might be able to kind of get that center position really locked up if you can get him and kind of get that assurance that he'll be ready for week one. I think receiver you at least have to look at with all the Deontay Johnson stuff. Do you talk about Tyler Boyd? Josh Reynolds, Noah Brown, someone like that. Really bad free agent tackle class. So, I mean, I would look at tackle, but not a lot of names that are going to pop off the screen to you. And then I think defensive line, you have to at least look at defensive line. There's just not a lot of guys that you have there, right? The depth pieces, Montravius Adams, Armon Watts are all leaving. Leal hasn't really turned in anything. So what are you kind of going to do there? Too. So I look at those, but that's just a few names. But I expect this to be pretty defensively heavy, and I also expect tomorrow to kind of be the day where Steelers start to snap up a few guys in free agency.
And as we sit here and record this 5-6 weeks out of the first round of the draft, how do you think the Steelers go round one? Right now, I would love to see them go center if a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson was available to them at number 20. I've seen the idea of Wiggins from Clemson if they go corner in round one as well. Where do you kind of fall on where you think maybe they will or should go?
I think offensive line, center or tackle. I think either of those work. They just need to make this as good as possible for Russell Wilson. I think, Jackson Powers Johnson is obviously a fantastic prospect that fits beautifully into this offense. So I think he makes sense. Tackle, it's so deep of a tackle class at the top. So you can get guys like Amarius Mims, J.C. Latham, Taliese Fuaga, Troy Fatanu. Now, not all those guys are going to be there 20, but two of them probably should be. Certainly one of them will be. So, you talk about that seven top offensive linemen. You can include Jackson Powers Johnson in there. They're probably one of them is going to be there. So that should be where they go, in my opinion. I expect them to. I expect corner to be kind of addressed in free agency a little bit. Not fully. They're going to have to draft a corner early, but I think we're going to be talking corner a little less urgently than we are going to be talking about tackle and center by the time the draft comes around. So those are kind of my names. One of those top 7 offensive linemen is kind of where I would go, unless you get a corner like Terrion Arnold or Quinion Mitchell falling.
He is Nick Farabaugh, Steelers Now, Steelers beat reporter. Nick, thanks for taking some time to chop it up with me about Russ coming to the Steelers as the story unfolds and all that stuff. We'll do it again. All right, man?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great to talk Russ, obviously, and Steelers country. Let's ride.